There is no shortage of interesting and unusual war stories which have emerged from the Israeli Air Force over the decades, but perhaps one of the strangest fights occurred in October 1973, when it has been said that a pair of Israeli F4 Phantoms engaged several North Korean MiGs. A fair warning must be given that the following claims have not been confirmed by the Israelis, but have nevertheless circulated for many years amongst pilots and enthusiasts, initially from claims made by the Egyptians. The story begins with Egypt strengthening relations with friendly nations to form a coalition against Israel, who had captured the Sinai Peninsula in 1967. However, when Anwar Sadat became president of Egypt in 1971, relations with the Soviets soured, as Sadat reorientated his country to the west. Nevertheless, the Egyptian leadership strove to improve this relationship for the sake of their economy and military supplies. The Egyptians desired to push the Israelis out of the Sinai Peninsula, which would become the Yom Kippur War. As with the Western Bloc alliance, nations in the Eastern Bloc would occasionally send personnel to their allies to train or fight alongside them. This was reported to be the case in the Middle East during the Yom Kippur War. This was an Egyptian and Syrian-led offensive to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, and it's highly possible that Soviet and Cuban pilots had flown within the ranks of the Syrian Air Force in that October of 1973. It is likely that Soviet pilots flew reconnaissance flights over Israel in the new MiG-25. What has been claimed is that North Korean pilots were sent to Egypt and reported by Israeli military intelligence to the press on August 15, 1973, just months before the start of the war. The Israeli claim was that 10 to 20 North Korean pilots were already in the country, likely training. The following day, the US State Department confirmed that the Israeli claim indeed held merit, as well as suggesting that the actual number of North Korean pilots may have been higher. The story, often associated with the claim, goes something like this. Two pairs of Israeli F4 Phantoms make their way south into Egyptian airspace. Leading the flight was Mir Gur of 69 Squadron. The sortie briefing suggesting suspicious activity somewhere south of Cairo, and the flight was to execute a high-altitude combat air patrol over the area. Gur recalls being over the target area in bad weather with poor visibility, having depleted most of their fuel. Then, flying at 25,000 feet, the Phantoms were vectored onto a possible contact by radars on the ground. Closing in, Gur picked up two faint blips on his radar, flying the same bearing but at a far lower altitude. Struggling to hold a lock against the ground clutter and lacking clear visibility to identify the contacts, Gur and his wingman closed in. Suddenly, both aircraft, MiG-21s, broke separate ways, having spotted the Israelis. The Phantoms engaged, dropping fuel tanks and attempting to lock up the MiGs. The lead MiG became lost in the clouds, whilst the second continued to engage both Phantoms alone. Gur recalls that the MiG pilot was particularly good at avoiding radar lock. He recalls that the MiG pilot had attempted to pull the Phantoms into a low-speed fight, but keeping in afterburner, both the Phantoms managed to maneuver with enough separation to fire sidewinders. Gur fired first, followed by his wingman, who, as Gur recalls, fired in poor visibility from behind the lead Phantom. Nevertheless, both missiles tracked and hit their target. However, the MiG emerged well enough intact, beyond trailing white smoke. It then broke off and descended. With both F4s critically low on fuel, the decision was made to leave the fight, since the MiG evidently posed little threat at this point. However, as the pair turned north to head home, they noticed a surface-to-air missile launch in their rear mirror, followed by an explosion high in the sky. Following their arrival back at base, they were told that the MiG they had engaged, having survived their sidewinders, had been shot down by an Egyptian SAM site on its way back to base. They had shot down their own aircraft. So is this claimed combat story actually true? Despite the initial claims of North Korean pilots operating within Egypt made months earlier, following the conflict, the Israelis denied that their pilots had shot down any Korean aircraft or personnel. This came in response to a claim put forward by the then leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who said that North Korean pilots had indeed engaged the Israelis during the war. Benny Paild, an Israeli Air Force chief, refuted these claims, instead suggesting that the North Korean pilots and their aircraft had remained out of the fight stationed at Bir Arida Air Base. However, the book Phoenix Over the Nile, recounting the history of the Egyptian Air Force, makes the same claim noted in the combat story, that North Korean pilots did indeed engage in a fight with Israeli Phantoms south of Cairo. Another book, Israel's Quest for Recognition and Acceptance in Asia, also makes mention of a similar event, noting that a supposed dogfight took place between Korean and Israeli pilots south of Cairo. The book also mentions Egyptian Lieutenant General Sa'adeddin Shazli, who said that North Korean pilots with MiG-21s took part in multiple combat missions with the Egyptians during the war. But the main source for most of this information comes from the book Hammers, Israel's long-range heavy bomber arm, the story of 69 Squadron, written by two Israelis, Shlomo Aloni and Zvi Avidror. The event is recalled by Meir Gur, along with quotes in which he details the unfolding events mentioned earlier. I think there is reason to take the Egyptian claim more seriously. Given the context, Israel had more to lose geopolitically if they were to announce that they had, albeit unknowingly, killed pilots from a foreign military. Egyptians associated with the story probably had less reason to deny the claims. If a true event, it makes for a great war story. Who knows how many other lesser-known military clashes there have been, yet kept quiet for political reasons.